Get ready to learn about the incredible story of a man who changed the course of the Catholic Church forever. He was not only the founder of the Order of Preachers and the leader of the Dominican Friars, but also a true giant of faith, a saint who with his own hands and words confronted heresies, healed the sick, and transformed lives. Did you know that he had an extraordinary vision that led him to create a spiritual weapon capable of overcoming evil, which is still used by millions of Catholics around the world today? Stay with me until the end of this video, and you will discover how this simple practice, revealed directly by the Virgin Mary, became St. Dominic's greatest legacy. On a quiet morning in 1170, when the first rays of sunshine kissed the mountains of Castile, a cry of joy echoed through the village of Caleruega, a small hamlet hidden among hills and vineyards. It was a simple place, inhabited by peasants who lived off the land, but marked by a deep faith passed down from generation to generation. There, a boy was born who would forever change the course of the Church's history, Dominic de Guzmán. The Guzmán family was noble, but unpretentious. Felix de Guzmán and Joana de Aza, Dominic's parents, were known for their generosity and piety. Felix was a respected man, a model of courage and honor, while Joana, his wife, was deeply devoted, known in the region for her life of prayer and charity. She was a woman of great spiritual strength, whose fervent faith touched all those around her. Before Dominic's birth, Joana had a dream that forever changed her perception of the child she was carrying. She saw a dog with a torch in its mouth, running through the world and illuminating everything in its path. The village elders interpreted this vision as a divine sign. The boy would bring light to the world, carrying the flame of truth and faith to the hearts of men. When Dominic was born, Joana held him in her arms and felt that there was something special about him. He was not just her son, he was a promise from God to the world. From a young age, Dominic was a different boy. While other children ran and played, he showed an intense curiosity about spiritual matters, a deep desire to learn and understand the mystery of faith. Even as a child, he surprised his parents with questions about God's love and Christ's teachings, displaying a wisdom that was uncommon for his age. The Guzmán family home, made of simple stones and wood, was a place of prayer and devotion. Every night, they gathered around a small hearth, and Joana, with her gentle voice, told stories of the life of Jesus and the saints. Dominic, with shining eyes, listened attentively, absorbing every word as if it were a direct lesson from God. These stories planted an insatiable thirst for truth in his heart, a flame that would never extinguish. One time, while walking through the fields with his mother, Dominic saw a man begging for alms. He was barefoot, and his clothes were dirty and torn. Without hesitation, young Dominic took off his own cloak and gave it to the man. Joana, watching closely, noticed something extraordinary in her son. He was not just helping, he was giving himself completely. The compassion he demonstrated went beyond ordinary kindness. It was a reflection of Christ's sacrificial love. Joana felt tears forming in her eyes, knowing she was witnessing something great, that this child had a purpose far greater than she could imagine. As he entered childhood, Dominic began attending the local church, where he was enchanted by the liturgical celebrations. The aroma of incense, the glow of candles, and the sacred hymns filled him with indescribable joy. He often assisted the priest, holding the missal with reverence, captivated by each gesture, each sacred word. His favorite place was near the altar, where he knelt for long periods in silent prayer. For the faithful of the small community of Caleruega, it was evident that Dominic was a special child, chosen by God for an extraordinary mission. It was also during this time that he began to develop his love for the poor. Upon seeing a starving family begging at the church door, he ran home and asked his mother for bread and water to offer to those in need. Joanna, moved by her son's compassion, gave him what little they had. When he returned to the church and delivered the food, the grateful smiles of those people marked his heart forever. Dominic understood, even at such a young age, that there is no greater joy than serving others, especially the most needy. It was as if Christ himself was smiling at him through those hungry faces. When he turned 7, Dominic began to be educated by his uncle, a priest in the region. He immediately distinguished himself, not only for his intelligence, but also for his discipline and humility. While other boys were reluctant to study, Dominic devoured the sacred texts and theology lessons with enthusiasm. He fell in love with the scriptures, especially the Gospels, and spent hours memorizing passages, absorbing each teaching as if it were a personal letter from God. One day, his uncle found him kneeling in prayer before a crucifix, tears in his eyes. When he asked why he was crying, Dominic replied, "How can anyone not love Christ so much, who gave his life for us?" These words, coming from a child, deeply impacted the priest, who saw there a soul already shaped by divine grace. Around the age of 12, Dominic began to feel an inner calling, a gentle but persistent voice inviting him to follow a path of total surrender to God. He did not yet know what the future held for him, but he was determined to say yes to anything God asked of him. It was then that Joanna, his mother, took him on a pilgrimage to a small church dedicated to Saint Nicholas, a saint who had also dedicated his life to serving the poor and oppressed. There, in front of the altar, Joanna knelt and surrendered her son to God, saying, "Lord, this son is yours. May he follow your will, wherever you lead him." Domingos rose with a new determination. He looked at his mother and realized that this was a decisive moment. It was not just a prayer, it was a consecration. From that moment on, he felt that his life no longer belonged to him, but was a living offering, prepared to serve the greater good. It was the first step towards a journey of faith that would lead him to become one of the greatest preachers in the history of the church. The village of Caleruega could not imagine the impact that boy would have on its future, but those who knew him understood they were witnessing something divine. Domingos grew up surrounded by love, prayer, and charity, shaped by the simple faith of a community that lived for God. And it was in this fertile ground that he planted his first roots, grounding himself in the faith that would sustain him through all the battles to come. By the end of his childhood, Domingos was no longer just a boy. He was a burning flame of love for God, a living torch ready to illuminate a world that was in darkness. The light that began to shine in Caleruega was just starting to ascend, promising to guide many souls to encounter the truth and love of Christ. At the age of 14, Domingos de Guzmán left Caleruega with a heart full of hope and unwavering faith, leaving behind the comfort of home to embark on a new phase of his life. His parents sent him to Palencia, a renowned center of studies in Spain, known for attracting brilliant minds from all over Europe. There, young aspirants gathered to learn philosophy and theology in the relentless pursuit of knowledge. But for Domingos, this journey would be much more than just an academic formation. It would be a test of his character and devotion to God. Upon arriving in Palencia, Domingos found a vibrant city filled with students, teachers, and religious. The narrow stone streets echoed with the sound of theological and philosophical discussions. The walls of the small taverns were imbued with the smell of wine and fresh bread as monks and scholars passed by carrying precious manuscripts. For Domingos, all of this was a new universe to explore. He quickly distinguished himself with his discipline and insatiable thirst for learning. It was not uncommon to see him in the front rows of classes, with his eyes fixed on the teachers, absorbing every word as if it were a treasure. Domingos devoted himself fervently to his studies. He knew that understanding doctrine was essential for defending the Christian faith and helping others find the path to truth. At the same time, his life of prayer was not neglected. While many students used the nights to rest or have fun, Domingos took refuge in the chapel, kneeling in silence before the altar, asking God for wisdom and discernment to use the knowledge acquired for good. However, during this time, Palencia was struck by a grave crisis. A devastating famine ravaged the region. What had once been a vibrant city, full of life, transformed into a place of despair. The fields were dry, and food became scarce. The streets were filled with beggars and hungry families, begging for any piece of bread. Domingos, who observed everything with a heavy heart, could not ignore the suffering around him. He began to feel a tremendous weight in his soul. How could he continue studying, surrounded by expensive books, while so many were dying of hunger outside the university walls? For Domingos, a life of study and prayer made no sense if it was not accompanied by concrete acts of charity. It was then that he made a surprising and radical decision. He sold all his books. At that time, books were rare and expensive items, handwritten and considered true treasures. A student without books was like a soldier without a sword. However, Domingos did not hesitate. He knew that those valuable objects could be transformed into food for the hungry. He walked to the local market, carefully carrying his books, and exchanged them for bags of grain and bread. Upon seeing that young student giving up his most precious resources, the merchants fell silent, awed by the courage and sacrifice they witnessed. Domingos then walked through the streets of Palencia, distributing food to those in need. The trembling hands of the hungry reached out to him, receiving with tears of gratitude the bread he offered. He said nothing, only smiled and made the sign of the cross over each of them. It was not a gesture of superiority, but of brotherhood. Domingos saw Christ in every weary face, in every pleading gaze. For many, Domingos's decision seemed like madness. His fellow students were perplexed, asking how he intended to continue his studies without books. The teachers initially reprimanded him, saying he had acted impulsively. But Domingos, calm and confident, responded simply, "Books are not more important than human life. How can I study about Christ if I ignore the suffering of my brothers around me?" This attitude of detachment had a significant impact in Palencia. He was not just giving alms, he was offering everything he had, demonstrating through actions what he believed in his heart. His generosity was a silent sermon, more powerful than any preaching. People began to look at that young man with new eyes, realizing that he was not an ordinary student. He possessed something that could not be found in books, the true wisdom of love. As time went on, hunger diminished and life in Palencia began to return to normal. But Domingos did not stop helping those in need. He continued visiting the sick, comforting the sad, and bringing hope to those who had lost everything. The experience of hunger profoundly transformed him. He understood that true theology was not just a matter of intellectual knowledge, but of living faith in practice, demonstrating God's love through concrete actions. During this period, Domingos also developed a deep love for the scriptures. Without his study books, he began to dedicate even more time to reading the Bible, which he considered the most valuable treasure. He became especially enamored with the Gospels, finding in the words of Jesus an inexhaustible source of inspiration. He spent hours meditating on the parables, miracles, and teachings of Christ, wishing to imitate every gesture and every act of love of the Savior. It was also in Palencia that Domingos began to notice the problem of heresies that were starting to spread across Europe. He heard rumors about Catharism, a doctrine that distorted the truth of the gospel and led many faithful away from the church. This news troubled his spirit, as he saw that ignorance and lack of understanding of the true faith were leading many souls astray. He then felt a growing fervor in his heart, a desire to preach, to teach, to bring the true doctrine to all who needed it. Upon completing his studies, Domingos was changed. He was no longer just a talented and intelligent young man. He was a man shaped by compassion and charity, ready to sacrifice everything for the love of God and neighbor. He left Palencia not with books or honors, but with the deep conviction that his life would be dedicated to preaching the gospel and serving the poor. Thus, upon leaving Palencia, Domingos did not leave behind just a university. He left a legacy of love and sacrifice, a living lesson that true wisdom is not found in books, but in a heart that gives itself unreservedly. He was heading toward the next chapter of his journey, with a soul strengthened by experience and a spirit prepared to face the challenges that lay ahead. After his studies in Palencia, Domingos de Guzmán returned to his homeland, carrying in his heart not only theological knowledge, but also a renewed faith and a burning desire to serve God even more fully. The young man, who had shown a compassionate spirit and deep love for the needy since childhood, now found himself faced with a crucial decision: to accept the call to the priesthood and fully dedicate himself to the service of the church. It was a choice that would change his life and lead him to a mission he could not yet fully imagine. At the age of 25, Domingos was ordained a priest. The moment of ordination was marked by a touching solemnity. The small church of Osma, with its stone walls and colorful stained glass, was filled with faithful who came to witness the beginning of a new journey in Domingos's life. As he lay on the ground in a sign of humility, arms outstretched in the form of a cross, he felt a profound peace flood his soul. The bishop laid his hands on his head, and in that instant, Domingos felt transformed. From that day on, he would no longer be just a student or a charitable young man. He would be a shepherd of souls, a spiritual guide, someone called to preach the truth and bring comfort to the afflicted. However, the life of a priest brought unexpected challenges. Domingos became a canon at the Cathedral of Osma, where his role was to pray the canonical hours and participate in daily liturgies. The monastic routine and constant prayers further shaped him, deepening his relationship with God. But for Domingos, life was not limited to the walls of the cathedral. He longed for more than chants and sacred rituals. He desired to find Christ on the roads, in the villages, in the faces of the poor and the excluded. Every time he went out to visit the faithful, he felt that his true vocation lay in being close to the people, listening to their pains and bringing them hope. It was in this context that Domingos met Bishop Diego de Osma, a wise and zealous man who soon recognized the potential of the young priest. The bishop saw that Domingos possessed a special gift. His humility and ability to listen to others made him an exceptional confessor, someone who conveyed God's mercy in a tangible way. Together, they formed a deep spiritual friendship based on trust and a shared vision of a church that should be closer to the faithful. Diego, aware of Domingos's talents, decided to take him on an important diplomatic mission. The King of Castile had asked the bishop to travel to Denmark on a task involving the arrangement of a royal marriage. It was a long and dangerous journey, but Diego believed that Domingos was the ideal person to accompany him. As they set off, Domingos knew that this trip would be an opportunity not only to serve the bishop, but also to see up close the difficulties that the church faced in other lands. During the journey, as they crossed villages and towns, Domingos began to notice something alarming: the spread of heresies, especially Catharism, which was rapidly spreading across Europe. The Cathars preached a dualistic doctrine, rejecting many of the fundamental teachings of Christianity. On a cold night, while staying at an inn in southern France, Domingos had an encounter that would change the course of his life. Noticing that the innkeeper was an Albigensian heretic, he decided not to confront him aggressively, but rather to engage in dialogue with love and patience. They sat around a simple table, illuminated only by a candle flickering in the wind, seeping through the cracks in the door. Domingos, with a calm and serene voice, began to speak about the gospel, explaining the true doctrine of Christ. The man, initially suspicious and defensive, gradually began to open his heart, touched by the kindness and clarity of Domingos's words. They spent the entire night in discussion, and by dawn, the heretic had changed his mind. He accepted Domingos's teachings and decided to reconcile with the church. This episode was a turning point for Domingos. He realized that many who followed heresies did so not out of malice, but out of ignorance and lack of understanding. Domingos then felt a new calling in his heart, the need to preach the truth in a clear, accessible and loving manner. He understood that the true battle would not be fought with swords, but with words and arguments grounded in love and mercy. After the success of the mission in Denmark, Domingos and Diego returned to France, where they were met with devastating news. The princess, for whom the marriage had been arranged, had passed away. The diplomatic purpose of the trip was interrupted, but something much greater had begun. Domingos did not see the setback as a defeat. He believed that God had a larger plan in mind. On the way back, Diego and Domingos witnessed up close the strength of heresies in southern France. Catharism had taken root in many villages, and the local clergy seemed unable to contain its spread. The priests lived lives of luxury and ostentation, in contrast to the Cathar preachers, who lived in extreme simplicity. Domingos clearly saw that the people were being deceived, drawn to a false spirituality that, at first glance, seemed more authentic than the preaching of the church. It was at this moment that Domingos began to develop the idea of a new form of preaching. Simple, stripped down, and based on the witness of life. He knew that to reach the hearts of people, he needed to present the truth not only with words, but also with actions. He decided that he would live in poverty, walking alongside the poor, preaching from village to village, offering not only doctrine, but also genuine love and compassion. Upon returning to Osma, Domingos was transformed. The young priest who had embarked on a diplomatic mission now carried a clear vision of his mission. He knew that the fight against heresies would not be waged with wars or persecutions, but through the sincere preaching of the gospel and the example of a pious life. He was ready to embrace his vocation as an itinerant preacher, one who would carry the flame of truth to the darkest places where faith had been distorted and forgotten. Domingos' journey was just beginning, but he had already found his purpose, to be a voice of light amid the darkness, guiding souls to the truth of Christ. The trip to Denmark and the encounter with Catharism left deep marks on Dominic of Guzmán. Upon returning to France, he faced a devastated spiritual landscape. Southern France was engulfed in a deep crisis of faith. Heresies like Catharism, also known as Albigensianism, spread like an uncontrollable fire. The Cathar preachers, with their apparent humility and austere lives, attracted more and more followers, while many local priests, accustomed to lives of luxury and comfort, were distant from the needs of the people. Domingos knew that something needed to change, and that God was calling him to a greater mission, to restore the true faith and bring back those who had strayed from the church. It was the year 1206. Accompanied by Bishop Diego, Domingos traveled through various villages and hamlets, facing not only the resistance of the heretics, but also the distrust of the faithful themselves. People were disillusioned with the clergy and found in the Cathars an alternative that seemed more authentic to them. Diego and Domingos understood that to combat these heresies, it would not be enough to simply condemn them. It would be necessary to offer a living example of true faith, a testimony embodied in love and simplicity of life. It was in this context that Domingos had an innovative idea to create a center for welcoming and training women who had left Catharism and wished to return to the Catholic faith. He knew that many of these women were trapped in lives of misery and isolation, rejected by their families and society. He found in Pruil, a small village at the foot of the Pyrenees, the ideal place to found this monastery. There, the first women's monastery of the Order of Preachers would be born, a true school of holiness and prayer. Domingos arrived in Pruil on a cold winter day. The biting wind swept across the empty fields, while the grey sky seemed to announce the gravity of the mission he had at hand. He walked slowly along the dirt paths, looking at the humble buildings scattered across the landscape. Upon arrival, he found a group of women, former Cathars, with suspicious and suffering looks. Some were barefoot, dressed in rags, carrying the weight of years of error and abandonment on their shoulders. Without hesitation, Domingos welcomed them with a smile and an outstretched hand. He did not look at them with condemnation, but with compassion. He invited them to enter, offering them not only a roof, but also a safe place where they could rediscover their dignity and faith. The women of Pruil were the first to experience the true heart of Domingos's mission, a preaching not of empty words, but of concrete gestures of love and mercy. The monastery in Pruil quickly became a refuge of peace. The women, many of them marked by deep traumas, found in Domingos a spiritual father, someone who listened to them and guided them with patience and tenderness. He taught them the prayers, explained the Gospels, and encouraged them to embrace a life of contemplation and service. At the same time, Dominic continued to preach in neighboring villages, facing the Cathar leaders in public debates, always with a spirit of humility and love. During one of these debates, held in Fangeau, a small town near Pruil, Dominic confronted a group of Albigensian preachers. The place was packed. Locals gathered to hear the clash of doctrines. The Cathar preachers appeared in their simple robes and austere faces, while Dominic, in his white tunic and black cloak, ascended the pulpit with a serene expression. He began to speak in a soft but firm voice, quoting scripture and explaining the true teaching of the Church about love, creation, and redemption. His arguments were not only theological, they were imbued with a living and experienced faith. At one point, one of the Cathar leaders stood up and accused Dominic of lying, claiming that his words were empty and unfounded. The audience murmured, and tension filled the air. Then Dominic did something unexpected. He proposed a test by fire. He suggested that both his writings and those of the Cathars be placed in the flames, and that God would reveal the truth. The Cathars accepted, confident that their texts would be protected by their doctrine. However, when the papers were thrown into the fire, the writings of the Cathars were quickly consumed by the flames, while those of Dominic remained intact. The miracle was witnessed by all present. Silence fell over the crowd, followed by gasps of astonishment and admiration. Dominic did not celebrate or boast. Instead, he knelt in prayer, thanking God for showing the truth so clearly. This event was a turning point, bringing many back to the Catholic faith and reinforcing the recognition of Dominic's unique charisma as a preacher and spiritual leader. In the following years, the monastery of Pruil flourished. The women who lived there became an example of communal life, dedicating themselves to prayer and charity. They wove clothes for the poor, welcomed travelers, and prayed incessantly for the success of Dominic's mission. In their hands, the Rosary became a powerful weapon against temptations and doubts that still haunted their souls. The practice of the Rosary, encouraged by Dominic, began to spread as an effective means of meditating on the mysteries of Christ's life, strengthening the faith and hope of all who recited it. Dominic continued tirelessly in his preaching. He walked miles on foot, facing cold rain and heat, driven only by his desire to bring the truth of the gospel to every soul. Often, he spent nights in vigil, praying for conversions and seeking strength to continue his mission. The few who accompanied him were impressed by his determination and joy, even in the face of great difficulties. The foundation of Pruil was the beginning of something greater, the precursor to the creation of the Order of Preachers. Dominic saw there the embryo of a new form of evangelization. Preachers who would live in poverty, who would be brothers in spirit and mission, dedicated to bringing the light of truth to all corners. He understood that it was not enough to preach in isolation. It was necessary to form a community that shared the same ideal and could multiply the impact of his mission. Dominic's journey, which had begun in Caleruega and led him through many lands, now found new momentum. He was no longer alone. He had planted the seeds of a movement that would grow and flourish, bringing the word of God to places where darkness seemed to have prevailed. It was the beginning of the 13th century, and the church was going through times of intense turmoil. Heresies were spreading across Europe, and many faithful were confused and disoriented. Saint Dominic de Guzmán, moved by a deep zeal for truth and the salvation of souls, began to realize that his individual actions, although fruitful, would not be enough to face the challenges ahead. He knew he needed something greater, something that could transform not just a community, but the entire church, a religious order focused on preaching, simplicity, and the dissemination of the true doctrine of Christ. The idea matured in his heart during years of travel and preaching. Dominic spent long nights in vigil, reflecting and praying. As he walked the dusty roads of southern France while the wind whistled through the trees, he thought about the challenges he faced. He saw heretical preachers living in poverty, gaining the trust of the people, while many clerics, trapped in luxury, distanced themselves more and more from the faithful. Dominic knew that to combat error, it was not enough to simply correct it. It was necessary to offer a living testimony, an example that could be seen and followed. On a sunny day in 1216, Dominic gathered his first companions in Toulouse, a city that buzzed with commerce, but also with heated religious debates. They were few, but they had something in common: a deep love for the truth and a total willingness to forsake everything in the name of the gospel. These first followers of Dominic became the embryo of the Order of Preachers, which would later be known as the Dominican Order. Dominic explained his vision to them. They would live in poverty, like the apostles, depend on divine providence for their sustenance, and dedicate themselves entirely to preaching and teaching. The creation of the order was a tremendous challenge. The church was accustomed to monastic orders dedicated to prayer and contemplation, but the idea of a mendicant order, which would go out on the roads preaching the gospel and debating with heretics, was something innovative. Many criticized Dominic, calling him idealistic and reckless, but he did not let himself be discouraged. He firmly believed that God had called him to this mission and was willing to face all difficulties to fulfill his vocation. Dominic traveled from town to town, preaching tirelessly and winning the hearts of the people. He presented himself as a beggar, dressed in a simple white tunic and a black cloak, carrying only a rosary and the gospel. When he arrived in a new village, he did not go directly to the churches or palaces, but instead to the squares and markets where the common people gathered. He spoke with a sweet but powerful voice, explaining the mysteries of faith in a clear and accessible way. People crowded around him, enchanted by the way he made the complex teachings of Christ understandable and relevant to their everyday lives. In Toulouse, Dominic had an important audience with the local bishop, Folco of Toulouse, to present his formal proposal to found the Order of Preachers. The meeting took place in a simple room of the episcopate, illuminated only by light streaming through a narrow window. Dominic, kneeling before the bishop, explained his project with humility, but also with a conviction that left no doubt about his seriousness. The bishop, touched by Dominic's sincerity and vision, not only approved his idea, but also offered his unconditional support, committing to help him obtain papal approval for the foundation of the new order. With the bishop's blessing, Dominic set off for Rome. The journey was long and full of dangers. He crossed mountains and forests, facing biting cold and sudden storms, but nothing seemed to shake his determination. He knew he was about to present his request to Pope Innocent III, a man known for his sharp intelligence and rigor in evaluating new proposals. Upon arriving in Rome, Dominic was exhausted, with a face marked by fatigue, but his eyes shone with the flame of his mission. The audience with the Pope was a crucial moment. Innocent III was one of the most powerful and influential pontiffs in the history of the Church, and his penetrating gaze examined every word of Dominic. He listened attentively as the saint explained his vision of an order of itinerant preachers dedicated to teaching the truth of the gospel, living in simplicity and poverty. The Pope hesitated for a moment, pondering the novelty of the proposal. Then something unexpected happened. Innocent III remembered a dream he had the night before, in which he saw the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Cathedral of Rome, about to collapse. In the dream, a simple man dressed in white and black garments held up the church with his own shoulders. Upon seeing Dominic before him, Innocent recognized the man from his dream and understood that this humble preacher was the answer God had sent him. The Pope granted his verbal approval for the foundation of the order, and Dominic returned to France with a heart full of joy. He knew he had achieved a great triumph, not by his own skill, but by divine will. When he gathered his followers in Toulouse, he announced the good news. They were officially recognized as the Order of Preachers. It was a moment of joy, but also of profound commitment. Dominic looked at his companions, who stood in a circle around him, and said with a firm voice, "We are here to preach the truth that is not ours, but Christ's. And for this truth, we are ready to live and, if necessary, die." The first years of the order were marked by intense missionary activity. The Dominican friars, under Dominic's leadership, quickly spread throughout France, Italy, and Spain, always bringing the word of God to the most forgotten places. They faced public debates, held sermons in the squares, and offered comfort to the sick and marginalized. Each friar followed Dominic's example, living in extreme poverty and relying on the charity of the faithful for their survival. But this simplicity and love for the truth were what made their preaching so powerful and effective. Dominic continued to lead the order with an unflagging spirit of service. He slept few hours, often lying directly on the floor, and spent the nights in prayer, asking God for the conversion of souls. In his moments of greatest fatigue, he did not complain, but rejoiced, knowing that each effort, each sacrifice, was an offering for the greater good of the Church. The foundation of the Order of Preachers was not only the pinnacle of St. Dominic's life, but the beginning of a spiritual revolution that would echo through the centuries. He had created a family of preachers who, armed with the truth and sustained by prayer, would bring the light of the gospel to a world that so desperately needed hope. As the Order of Preachers solidified, the figure of St. Dominic de Guzmán became increasingly recognized and respected. However, his popularity was not only due to his charisma or the creation of the order, it was his zeal for the truth and his boldness in confronting heresies that set him apart. Dominic knew that Europe was going through dangerous times. The Albigensian heresies, especially strong in the Languedoc region, distorted the faith and divided communities. Dominic did not just preach. He publicly debated, confronting doctrinal errors with impressive clarity. And it was during one of these debates that one of the most remarkable and extraordinary episodes of his life occurred, the miracle of the burning book. The year was 1215. The city of Fanzhou, an important center for the dissemination of Cathar ideas, had become a spiritual battlefield. The discussions between Catholic preachers and Cathar leaders attracted crowds. Dominic, with his black cloak and white tunic, stood out among the crowd. He was not an imposing-looking man, but his presence radiated a silent strength. As he stepped up to the makeshift pulpit, he felt the weight of every gaze upon him, knowing that he was not just defending the doctrine of the Church, he was defending the truth of Christ. The square was filled with curious men and women. Some were there to listen, others to contest. The air was thick with tension. Domingos began his sermon by citing the scriptures and explaining the true nature of Christ as true God and true man, a truth that the Cathars rejected, preferring a dualistic view that denied the goodness of material creation. The debate was long and heated, with Cathar preachers attacking the Catholic faith and trying to undermine Domingos's arguments. It was then, in the heat of the discussion, that one of the Cathar leaders, known for his eloquence and cunning, suggested a challenge that surprised everyone. He proposed that the texts of both doctrines be thrown into the fire so that God, through the flames, would reveal which was the true one. The crowd fell silent, anxious and apprehensive. Many thought Domingos would refuse the test, but he accepted it calmly. For him, there was no doubt about the truth he defended. If the people needed a sign, he trusted that God would not allow his word to be destroyed. A bonfire was quickly prepared in the center of the square. The fire crackled, illuminating the tense faces of the crowd that had gathered around. The heat of the flames contrasted with the cold wind blowing, stirring the robes of Domingos and the Cathar preachers. The writings of the Cathars were thrown into the flames first, and within seconds they turned to ashes. The people murmured, some whispering that this was a sign. Then it was time for Domingos's writings, which contained his theological explanations and citations from the scriptures. Domingos, with a calm gesture, threw his book into the fire. The sound of the pages falling into the flames resonated like a silent thunder. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the book to be consumed as well. But to everyone's surprise, the book floated for a moment, spun among the flames, and landed intact outside the bonfire. The people gasped in astonishment. Some knelt, others wept. The Cathars, perplexed and speechless, tried to argue that it had been a coincidence. Domingos, however, did not deliver a victory speech. Instead, he knelt on the stone floor and began to pray silently, thanking God for confirming the truth he had preached. This event had profound repercussions. Many of those present abandoned heresy and returned to the Catholic faith. For Domingos, however, the miracle was not a proof of superiority, but a reaffirmation of his mission. He did not take pride in it, nor did he make the miracle a trophy. For him, that sign was a reminder of the responsibility he carried. The defense of the truth was a sacred calling that required humility and total dedication. After the miracle at Fanjo, Domingos' reputation as a preacher and defender of the faith spread rapidly. People came from far and wide to hear his words, seeking guidance and comfort amid the spiritual confusion of the time. Public debates continued, but now Domingos was received with more respect even by his opponents. His way of preaching was not aggressive. He sought to touch hearts with reason and love. He knew that true conversion did not come from fear or force, but from understanding and experiencing the love of Christ. In his travels, Domingos began to be accompanied by a growing group of followers who were inspired by his example. They gathered to pray the Rosary, which Domingos promoted as a form of meditation on the mysteries of the lives of Jesus and Mary. The Rosary became a spiritual weapon for the Dominican friars, helping them to strengthen their faith and face the challenges of their mission. Domingos knew that the spiritual battle he waged was not only against heresies, but also against indifference and ignorance. He understood the need to train preachers who could teach effectively, and thus he dedicated himself to training his companions, encouraging them to study the scriptures and theology deeply. He taught them that knowledge should always go hand in hand with humility and compassion. For him, a preacher who did not love those he taught was not worthy of his mission. Domingos spent his nights in prayer, often lying on the cold stone floor, with his face turned toward the altar. He prayed to God for the conversion of sinners, for his friars, and for all those still trapped in the darkness of heresy. Despite the many difficulties, he never lost hope. He firmly believed that, through example and preaching, the light of truth could illuminate even the hardest of hearts. Over time, the impact of Domingos's preaching was felt throughout Europe. The order of preachers expanded rapidly, establishing convents in various cities. But Domingos did not concern himself with numbers or recognition. For him, each soul saved was an invaluable treasure, and each transformed life a victory of the gospel. The miracle of the burning book in Fanjo became a symbol of Saint Domingos's commitment to the truth. He had put his faith to the test, and God had confirmed him. This episode profoundly marked the spirit of the Dominican Order, which since then dedicated itself to proclaiming the truth with courage and to facing the challenges of evangelization with a heart burning with love. Domingos continued his mission, aware that the battle for faith was unceasing. He knew that each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to serve God and others. In the early years of the Order of Preachers, Domingo de Guzmán faced great challenges in his mission to evangelize and rescue lost souls from heresies. He saw, with an anguished heart, how error spread through villages and entire towns, confusing the faith of the simple and leading many away from the true teaching of Christ. Amidst this spiritual battle, a practice emerged that would become one of his greatest contributions to the Church: the spread and promotion of the Holy Rosary. It is said that during a night of vigil and prayer, while Domingo was in deep meditation, he was overcome by intense sadness. Conversions were happening, but slowly, and he felt that his preaching, no matter how fervent and true, did not reach hardened hearts. Lying on the cold floor of a small chapel, he pleaded with God for a new way, an effective means to touch the souls that were immersed in the darkness of ignorance and sin. It was at this moment that, according to tradition, the Virgin Mary appeared to him, offering him a gift that would forever change the course of his mission: the Rosary. The vision of Mary was of incomparable beauty. She held a simple cord with small knots forming a crown of roses and explained to Domingo that this would be his new spiritual weapon. The Rosary was to be prayed and taught to the people as a form of meditation on the mysteries of Christ's life, from his incarnation to his glorious resurrection. Domingo listened with a heart full of reverence and joy. He knew that this was not just a prayer, but a powerful tool for intercession and conversion. The next day, Domingo, with a new flame of hope in his eyes, went to the central square of Carcassonne, where crowds would gather to hear debates and preaching. He carried no books or scrolls, only the Rosary wrapped in his hands. He began to explain to the people the simplicity and depth of this new practice. The people, accustomed to long theological sermons, grew curious. How could such a simple prayer hold so much power? Domingo began to pray the Rosary aloud, and gradually the crowd joined him. The Hail Marys intertwined with the meditation of the mysteries, and the gentle rhythm of the prayers created a reverent silence in the square. For the first time, many of those peasants and workers experienced a form of prayer that did not require deep theological knowledge, but offered a direct connection to the mysteries of Christ's life. When they finished the Rosary, Domingo looked around and saw tears in the eyes of many people. There was something new there, something that transcended words. It was the power of Mary's intercession, uniting the faithful in a common prayer. The fruits of this practice were soon evident. Entire families, previously divided by the confusion of heresies, began to pray the Rosary together, rediscovering peace and unity. Domingo traveled from village to village, always with his rosary in hand, teaching the people to pray it and explaining the mysteries they meditated on. He said that the rosary was like a rope that united heaven and earth, a channel of grace that allowed the faithful to immerse themselves in the life of Christ and Mary. His preaching, now accompanied by this devotion, touched hearts in a new and transformative way. On one of these journeys, Domingo met an elderly man, a former Cathar who had abandoned the Catholic faith many years ago. The man, his face marked by time and doubt, approached Domingo with a skeptical expression. He had heard about the Rosary and wanted to know what was so special about this simple prayer. Domingo, with patience and love, invited the man to sit beside him and began to pray the Rosary with him, explaining each mystery, detailing the life of Christ and the importance of each event. When they reached the fifth mystery, the meditation on the crucifixion of Jesus, the elderly man began to cry. His tears were not only of remorse, but also of relief, as if a burden he had carried for decades had been lifted from his shoulders. When they finished the prayer, the man with a trembling voice confessed to Domingo that he felt for the first time in many years the peace he had lost. He promised to dedicate the rest of his days to praying the Rosary and teaching his children and grandchildren to do the same. From that moment on, devotion to the Rosary spread rapidly, not only among the Dominican friars, but throughout Europe. Domingo, with his example of life and preaching, demonstrated that the Rosary was not merely a repetition of prayers, but a true meditation on God's love for us. He encouraged everyone to pray, from the simplest peasants to the nobles and scholars, explaining that the Rosary was a prayer for all, regardless of their social position or level of knowledge. The impact of the spread of the Rosary was immense. In many regions where heresy had previously flourished, groups of faithful could now be seen praying the Rosary together, in squares, churches, and even in their homes. Domingo realized that communal prayer had a powerful effect, uniting people and creating a spiritual force capable of transforming even the hardest of hearts. He saw the Rosary as a chain of faith that connected each soul to Christ and Mary, a practice that, even after his death, would continue to illuminate the path of the faithful. In the last years of his life, Domingo dedicated daily hours to the recitation of the Rosary, even when he was tired or ill. He knew that this devotion was one of the greatest gifts he could leave to the Church. When asked about the secret of his effectiveness as a preacher, he simply pointed to the Rosary and said that it was his weapon, the sword he used to defend the truth and save souls. The legacy of Saint Dominic and the Rosary would endure through the centuries, serving as a constant source of grace and comfort for millions of faithful around the world. At 50 years old, Saint Dominic de Guzmán was exhausted, but his inner flame burned brighter than ever. Years of tireless preaching, long journeys on foot, and nights in vigil had worn down his body but strengthened his spirit. He had founded the Order of Preachers, popularized the Rosary, and defended the faith in public debates. However, his work was far from over. The challenges he faced at the end of his life were even greater, and Dominic knew he had little time to fulfill his mission. He was determined to spend every moment spreading the light of the gospel. In the last years of his life, Dominic began to travel even more intensively. He wanted to personally visit each of the convents he had founded, not only to supervise, but to encourage his Dominican brothers. In his visits, he was not the austere founder that people expected to see. Instead, he presented himself as a brother equal, humbly kneeling to pray alongside the younger friars. He was a leader who preferred to listen, advise, and console rather than impose orders. One night, while in Bologna, Dominic had an intimate conversation with his friars. Gathered in a small room lit only by a few candles, he noticed that many of them were discouraged. The challenges of the mission, the dangers of travel, and the constant opposition from heretics and critics were beginning to weigh on the younger ones. Dominic, with a tender look, stood up and spoke with a soft but firm voice. "My brothers, never forget why we are here. We have not been called to a life of comfort, but to preach the truth. If we suffer, it is because we are following in the footsteps of Christ, and if we are tired, we must remember that He carries us." These words rekindled the spirit of the friars. Dominic had a unique ability to inspire those around him, not by promising ease, but by showing the value of sacrifice and the joy of total surrender to God. He knew that his brothers would face many trials, but he believed that through prayer and unity, they could overcome any difficulty. During his visits, he often insisted on the importance of community life, mutual support, and sharing everything from sorrows to joys. One day, in a small village in Italy, Dominic stopped to preach in a local church. The chapel was simple, with stone walls and rough wooden benches. The villagers, many of whom had never seen the founder of the Order of Preachers, gathered curiously. Dominic climbed to the pulpit and, instead of a grand sermon, began to tell a story. He spoke about God's love, using simple images and examples drawn from rural life that those people knew so well. He talked about the sower who cast his seeds in faith, not knowing if they will fall on fertile soil, but believing that God will give the growth. At the end of the preaching, an elderly woman, her face marked by wrinkles and the hardships of life, approached him with tears in her eyes. She told Dominic that she had lost her faith years ago, after the death of her only son, and that she could not find comfort. Dominic looked into her eyes, held her hands, and with a voice filled with compassion said, "My sister, Christ knows what it is to lose a son. He walks by your side in your pain, even when you do not feel Him. His love never abandons you." The woman, touched by his words and the sincerity in his gaze, felt the weight of her sorrow lift. Dominic did not just preach, he lived the love he proclaimed, and that love had the power to heal the deepest wounds. In the last months of his life, Dominic was struck by a violent fever. He was in Bologna, a city that had become an important center for the Dominican Order. Even while ill, he continued to pray with the friars and to guide those who came seeking his counsel. When he could no longer rise from his bed, he requested to be laid on the floor in an act of humility and detachment. He did not want the comforts that might distract him from his total surrender to God. On his deathbed, surrounded by the friars he loved so much, Dominic asked everyone to unite in prayer. He knew that his departure was imminent, but he was at peace. He looked at his brothers, many of whom were silently crying, and said, "Do not weep, my children. From where I am going, I will be able to help you more than I ever could here." With these words, he reinforced the certainty that his mission would continue even after his death, through the prayers and efforts of his followers. On the morning of August 6, 1221, Dominic surrendered his spirit. The silence in the room was broken only by the sound of the friars' prayers, thanking God for the gift of his life. There were no grand ceremonies or honors as he had wished. His body was buried in a simple grave in the church of Bologna, where it remained as a sign of his humility and detachment. However, even after his death, the miracles attributed to Saint Dominic began to spread throughout Europe. Many reported cures and conversions after praying at his tomb. Pope Gregory IX, upon receiving numerous reports about Dominic's deeds, initiated the process of canonization. In 1234, just 13 years after his death, he was officially declared a saint by the Church in recognition of his life of holiness and the lasting impact of his ministry. The legacy of Saint Dominic of Guzmán was not limited to his time. He had created an order that would continue to grow and spread the light of the gospel throughout the world. But more than that, he had shown everyone that the true power of preaching does not lie in eloquent words, but in love lived authentically. Every step, every word, and every prayer of Saint Dominic were driven by a burning desire to lead souls to Christ. And that flame, which he ignited during his life, would never be extinguished but would continue to shine through the centuries, guiding millions of people to truth and love. As the years passed, even after his death, Saint Dominic of Guzmán was not forgotten. On the contrary, his legacy grew and expanded, crossing borders and centuries. The Dominican friars, inspired by the example of their founder, continued his mission of preaching, living in poverty, and dedicating themselves to teaching the truth. However, there was something more that accompanied Dominic's name. A trail of miracles and intercessions that became known throughout Europe, solidifying his fame for holiness. After his death in Bologna, Dominic's tomb became a place of pilgrimage. People from all social classes came to visit his humble grave, bringing their pains, their afflictions, and their requests. Initially, the Dominican friars watched in surprise as the visits increased each week. Men and women knelt in prayer beside the tomb, leaving flowers and candles, whispering their requests with deep faith. Soon after, reports of miraculous healings began to emerge. One of the most well-known stories is of a young girl named Beatrice, who arrived in Bologna carried by her family. Beatrice had been paralyzed after a fall, and all medical treatments had failed. Desperate, her parents brought her to Dominic's tomb, believing that only a miracle could help her. The church was filled with pilgrims that day, and the air was filled with the sound of prayers. The family placed Beatrice on the ground near the tomb and began to pray fervently, asking for the saint's intercession. As her mother silently wept, Beatrice felt something inexplicable, a gentle warmth spreading through her legs like a warm breeze. She tried to move her feet and, to her astonishment, succeeded. Slowly, with her father's help, she stood up. What began as a whisper of surprise transformed into a cry of joy when the girl took her first steps alone. The news spread quickly, and many who were present witnessed the miracle. Beatrice and her family returned to their town, telling everyone about the healing they had received, and St. Dominic's tomb became even more sought after. In addition to physical healings, many spiritual miracles were also attributed to St. Dominic. There were cases of people who had completely lost their faith, but after praying by his tomb, felt a profound renewal in their souls, as if a dark cloud had been lifted from their hearts. On one occasion, a man named Robert, a merchant known for his dissolute life and anti-religious attitudes, came to Bologna for business. He visited the church almost by accident, drawn by curiosity at the number of people gathered there. As he approached the tomb, he felt a shiver run down his spine. Something inside him compelled him to kneel, and he began to cry uncontrollably. When he stood up, he told the friars, "I can't explain what happened, but I feel like I was touched by something I've never felt before. I want to change my life." The Dominican friars carefully documented these accounts, not as a means of boasting, but to recognize the divine action through Dominic. They believed that he continued to intercede for those seeking truth, even after his death, as he had promised in his final days. They saw these signs as a testimony to the holiness of their founder and the truth of his mission. However, it was not only the miracles that made the name of St. Dominic endure. His revolutionary approach to evangelization, based on humility and communal life, transformed the way the Catholic Church engaged in preaching. Dominic had created a new category of religious, the mendicant friars, who did not live cloistered in monasteries, but went out to meet the people, preaching in the squares, markets, and along the roads. He believed that preaching should be accessible and close, that the people needed to see the example of Christian life before even hearing the words. In many cities, the Dominican friars became central figures, working not only as preachers but also as counselors and teachers. Dominic had encouraged his followers to study the scriptures and theology deeply, so they could defend the faith wisely and respond to the intellectual challenges of the time. This made the Dominicans stand out in the universities of Europe, where they began to teach and influence generations of students. The impact of the order was visible. In 13th century Paris, for example, Dominican friars like St. Thomas Aquinas emerged as great masters, carrying forward the spirit of their founder. Dominican philosophy and theology, anchored in the pursuit of truth and reason, illuminated by faith, shaped the Church's thought and continue to influence to this day. Each new generation of friars saw in Dominic a model of humility, prayer, and total dedication to the service of God and others. A significant episode reflecting Dominic's spirit occurred in Milan, where a Dominican friar, inspired by the saint's example, decided to confront an angry crowd that wanted to expel the friars from the city, accusing them of being agents of the church to collect tithes. Courageously, the friar stood before the crowd and, holding the rosary, proclaimed, "Just like Saint Dominic, we are here to serve, not to be served. If you want to expel us, do so, but know that we leave in peace, taking only prayer and leaving our faith." The crowd, impressed by the humility and courage of the friar, withdrew. Domingo's example continued to inspire and transform hearts, even indirectly. The last years of Domingo's life were not the most glorious in terms of visible achievements, but they were the most profound in terms of spiritual impact. He had planted seeds that would continue to grow for centuries. The Dominican friars, his mustard seeds as he liked to call them, flourished in every corner of the world, carrying with them the spirit of preaching and love that Domingo had instilled in them. When Pope Gregory IX finally canonized Domingo in 1234, it was more than a recognition of his deeds. It was a testament to the holiness of a man who, in life, had been a beacon of light in times of darkness. On August 6, 1221, the body of Saint Domingo de Guzmán was buried in the humble church of Saint Nicholas in Bologna. There was no great pomp or elaborate procession, as was customary for religious figures of the time. Thus he had wished a simple burial, befitting his life of humility and detachment. But for those present, the silence and the murmured prayers spoke louder than any public tribute. On that day, the order of preachers lost its father and guide, but the world gained a saint whose actions, words, and example would continue to echo through the centuries. After his death, Domingo's tomb quickly became a center of devotion. Friars and faithful from all over Europe made pilgrimages to pray there, seeking comfort and intercession. In the following years, stories of miraculous healings, visions, and profound conversions began to emerge. It was as if the flame that Domingo had ignited in life continued to burn, now even more intensely. The place became a sanctuary of faith, where the humble and the powerful came in search of peace and answers. However, more than the physical miracles, the true miracle lay in the lasting impact of his spiritual legacy. Domingo had planted the seed of a new form of evangelization, a model that combined a love for truth, simplicity of life, and devotion to preaching. The Dominican Order, which he had founded with such zeal, quickly spread throughout Europe and beyond, carrying the flame of truth to places where faith had grown dormant. The growth of the order was dizzying. In just a few decades, the Dominican friars established themselves in major cities and universities across Europe. They were known for their scholarship and missionary zeal, but also for the humility they learned from their founder. Each friar who donned the black and white habit carried with him the spirit of Domingo, the passion for preaching and the tireless quest for the conversion of souls. The order became a pillar of the Church, playing a crucial role in the intellectual formation and defense of the Catholic faith. Domingo had been a visionary in understanding the importance of education in preaching. He encouraged his friars to study the scriptures, theology, and philosophy deeply, believing that knowledge was a powerful tool for touching hearts and dispelling doubts. This legacy manifested itself extraordinarily in the figure of St. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian of the order and one of the greatest intellectuals in the history of the Church. Thomas, following in Domingo's footsteps, dedicated his life to study and preaching, and his writings became the foundation of Catholic doctrine for centuries. But Domingo's legacy was not limited to the cloisters of universities or the altars of churches. It manifested in the squares, villages, and fields. In every corner of Europe, groups of lay people began to organize around the devotion to the Rosary, a practice that Domingo had promoted with such fervor. The Rosary confraternities became true schools of prayer, teaching ordinary people to meditate on the mysteries of Christ's life and to find solace in their daily tribulations. The Rosary prayer, which Domingo loved so much, continued to transform lives and unite communities. In 1234, just 13 years after his death, Domingo was canonized by Pope Gregory IX. The canonization process was one of the fastest in the history of the Church, a reflection of the deep popular devotion and the number of miracles attributed to his intercession. During the canonization ceremony, the Pope described Domingo as a true imitator of the apostles, someone who had lived with the same fervor and simplicity as the first disciples of Christ. For the Dominican friars who were present, it was a moment of profound joy and gratitude. They knew that their founder, who had so often rejected honors in life, was now recognized as a saint of God. With the canonization of Saint Domingo, the fervor of devotion to him spread even further. Churches and chapels dedicated to his name began to spring up all over Europe, from the hills of Spain to the plains of Germany. The style of preaching he instituted became the new standard, influencing not only Dominicans, but also other religious orders and diocesan priests. The humility, intellectual rigor, and simple devotion that characterized Domingo were now imitated by countless preachers who saw in him a model to follow. One of the greatest signs of Domingo's legacy was seen in times of crisis. During the Black Death in the 14th century, when despair and death ravaged Europe, many Dominican friars stood out for their courage and selflessness. Inspired by Domingo's example, they remained by the sick, praying the Rosary and offering the sacraments, even at the risk of their own lives. This heroism has been recognized and remembered for generations, and the figure of Saint Dominic has become a symbol of unwavering faith and love for one's neighbor. Over the centuries, the legacy of Saint Dominic continued to expand. Dominican missionaries took the gospel to Asia, Africa, and America, often facing great dangers and suffering martyrdom. Everywhere in the world, the friars carried with them the spirit of their founder, preaching with humility and defending the truth. In distant lands, devotion to Saint Dominic flourished, and churches dedicated to him were built, where thousands of faithful gathered to pray and learn. Today, more than he was a man of his time, but his message is eternal: the relentless pursuit of truth, simplicity of heart, and unconditional love for lost souls. To conclude, we invite you to subscribe to the Sacred Voices channel and be part of our community. If this story of Saint Dominic de Guzmán touched your heart, leave a comment with your opinion, share the video with friends and family, and don't forget to leave your like so we can continue bringing inspiring stories. 100 years after his death, the name of Saint Dominic de Guzmán is still spoken with reverence and love. His spirit lives on in those who, like him, dedicate their lives to preaching the gospel, in those who pray the Rosary in search of comfort, and in those who face the difficulties of life with the same courage and joy that he demonstrated. The modern world, with its rapid changes and constant challenges, still finds inspiration in the figure of Saint Dominic. We also want to know which saints you would like to see in upcoming videos. Your participation is very important to us and helps us spread these messages of faith and hope.